Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking up with Marvel Zombies Resurrection. The one shot, like the story that kind of said, hey, like Marvel Zombies is coming back, it came out like a year ago, right? So if I'm being honest, I think Marvel may have kind of missed the hype. I think Marvel got wind of the fact that DC was doing a zombie story, and Marvel wanted to beat him to the punch, but then didn't really have a plan, so nothing ever came out after, and then we got Deceased in the meantime, which is like an amazing story. So I don't know, like I'm not really sure what the grand plan is with this. I mean, it's only 4 issues, right? So it's not super lengthy, but nonetheless, in the Resurrection one shot, right, it was the idea that like Galactus was kind of out there in space, just kind of seemed to be floating or what have you. But the various superheroes, or at least a series of superheroes, went out there to investigate what was going on. And some pretty heavy hitters ended up traveling out there for the purpose of like understanding what was happening, right? Because they may need some pretty heavy hitters, especially when you're dealing with Galactus or something like that. We ended up basically finding out that like the zombie infection was there, right? And I don't believe that we got an origin point, which is to say where it came from. I believe it was just there. But regardless, all these various superheroes ended up coming back to Earth who were infected, and of course the whole zombie apocalypse spread fast. Now, we're not given a whole lot in terms of like how it was that it spread, which kind of makes sense. In the original zombie story, we never got that. The original zombie story just seemingly picked up in the middle of everything and then just kind of went forward from there, right? But nonetheless, you know, we may end up getting some kind of backstory either later on in this series or possibly as like a companion series, like a tie-in that Marvel might release somewhere along the line. But the overall gist is that because Peter Parker had at one point in time been part of the Future Foundation, which was kind of an offshoot of the Fantastic Four, and even part of the Fantastic Four team itself, ultimately he was tasked by Reed and Susan to keep an eye on Valeria and Franklin, right? To basically keep an eye on them to make sure they stay safe. And it's kind of interesting that Franklin's here because he has such vast reality warping powers. I'm kind of curious what role he's going to play, right? Because where Peter is basically rescuing them and trying to get them out of harm's way, get them as far away from the conflict as they possibly can. Of course, the Vulture swoops in. The Vulture, you know, takes out a part of the thing. And it's like, okay, you know, like not a great big huge deal. But then here comes Johnny Storm. And Johnny Storm, because of the fact that he's infected, comes crashing into the device and basically sends like the entire ship crashing down, right? So it has like Valeria and everybody just like fleeing for their life, like, you know, crying and carrying on. And then Peter Parker kind of falls. Now, that's where we sort of pick up with what's going on in the moment, right? That was kind of the outbreak moment, right? That's all we really got. And then at the moment right now, we basically have, we've got Moonstone here. I don't know why Moonstone is here. But then you've also got Franklin. You got Franklin a little bit older. You got Valeria, and you've got Forge. Now, for Moonstone, an important thing to understand about her character is it seems like she may or may not play a more significant role later. She had the ability to like manipulate light. She had super strength, super speed, different things like that. She's by no means a showstopper, but she is here because she's one of the survivors. And what seems to have been going on here is that led by Forge, they're just traveling from one location to the next, seemingly trying to use Forge's trek to basically locate like a safe haven. But they've just kind of been on this journey not too long after the fall of what seems to be New York and probably the rest of the world to find some measure of a safe haven. The issue with this is that along the way, of course, we're kind of given this idea that making noise, different things like that is not a good idea because it'll attract what they call the respawn, which is basically just, you know, the undead. And the result of this is kind of like, okay, like they end up, you know, killing a few of them, and that's basically it. But the really big moment that kind of comes out of all this is that once those forces are destroyed, you end up having the appearance of Nightcrawler. And this is one of the coolest things, right? Because Nightcrawler is a character that's painfully underrated in Marvel Comics, right? In a lot of different ways. And I say that because I think that as X-Men fans, we know the worth of Nightcrawler, but it's one of these things where like when you see him, unless you were reading like the Manifest Destiny Nightcrawler story, there weren't a whole lot of instances where he was given like any real due. And so of course, with him teleporting around, the other part of this is that Forge is basically familiar with Nightcrawler, familiar enough that he's able to take this guy on and ultimately take him out. But the other thing that goes on here is he's basically using the optic visor of Cyclops. Now the visor is attached to a rig on his back, right? So like obviously it's channeling energy from there. I don't really know why the optic beams of Cyclops are necessary unless, you know, Forge somehow found some kind of device where he's using a kind of energy where, you know, using the beams of Cyclops, or at least the visor of Cyclops seems to be the most useful. With Nightcrawler teleporting around, they simply can't keep up with him. And so what we end up doing is getting the appearance of Nana. Now Nana is a character they had kind of been talking talking about, that Valeria had been mentioning a couple times, and that she, you know, that Franklin takes very close to Nana, and is really kind of used Nana as like a surrogate, you know, mother figure almost, or somebody there to take care of him. But Nana was basically reprogrammed by Valeria, and the reason why is because Nana is just a great big huge sentinel, right? It's just like literally, it looks like an Omega Sentinel, like an Office of National Emergency Sentinel, but it was reprogrammed by Valeria for the purpose of protecting Franklin. Now, one thing to understand, this is kind of a funny thing when it comes to Marvel, size isn't everything. Just because you're big doesn't necessarily mean you're really worth anything. What it really comes down to, this is going in all the wrong ways. What it really comes down to is the foe you're facing off against. And for all the size the Sentinels have, they're actually pretty easy to take out. Like, believe it or not, like they're pretty easy to destroy, just a being of sufficient power. Now, we don't really know what modifications have been made to Nana, and that's really where things kind of stand the test of what's going on. We don't really know what modifications have been made, and Valeria is probably the smartest person in the world right now. Assuming that Dr. Doom's not alive, we know that Reed basically was taken by the zombies, so like at least he was one of the early ones to be infected. And so because of that, it's like, okay, I wonder what is fully capable of, right? Because it's one thing when it's machines rebuilding themselves, but machines are still limited by what they understand at that point in time. And Valeria is much smarter than a machine, right? She's the smartest person in the world, and even before Reed and assuming Doom died, she was still one of the smartest people in the world. She kind of switched the number one spot with those three guys, and so for her to rebuild this in such a way seems pretty interesting. But the other part of this is that Peter takes personal offense to the idea of Forge actually leading them to the X-Men mansion, because what he feels like is they've kind of been manipulated. Now, this is sort of the issue you run into with this, right? This is one of the issues that you run into with how Zombies Resurrection is being done so far. Because we get so little backstory, because we get so little brick and mortar kind of filling things in, the reason and the motivations for why characters feel the way they do is kind of lost on us. We know Peter Parker was tasked with keeping Valeria and Franklin safe. We know that Nan is also there, and that Peter Parker will always keep an eye on them. We don't know how they ran into Moonstone. We don't really know why it is that he's pissed off about the fact that Forge brought them to the Xavier Mansion, outside of the fact that, like, you know, you've just been accidentally leading us here to the Xavier Institute. You know, I mean, there is a kind of explanation insofar as, like, because of the fact that the Xavier Institute housed so many mutants, that if we show up here and these mutants are infected, like, we're guaranteed to die. But at the end of the day, Peter has a spider sense. Now, the other thing going on is because the spider sense is happening all the time, he's developing like these headaches. And Forge's theory is that if they go on long enough, they'll basically kill him, right? So like they've got to finally basically find a place to, one, keep Peter safe so his spider sense can calm down, and two, like basically a refuge of sorts, right? Forge's stance for being here makes a lot more sense in the idea that the Xavier Institute was a veritable fortress, right? There's food and resources to last them 500 years. There's all kinds of technology there. More so than that, he believes that they can find some kind of a ship to get them to the space arcs, and that's one of the first indications that we get that humanity fled the planet, right? That in light of everything that was going on, humanity bailed. Because of that, once they finally make their way into the house and they basically start poking around, they find a few things, right? The place looks like it was kind of ransacked to a degree. There's the concern that any of the resources that were there could be taken, but then they find all this crazy writing on the wall, and this writing belongs to a group called the Deadheads, right? And the idea was that when the outbreak happened, that there kind of arose a sort of cult that saw the Deadheads, or saw like the respawns, right? Like, you know, beings who were basically reanimated as being like the next step in evolution. It is kind of crazy, but one of the important things this does tell us is that no small measure of time had passed between when the outbreak originally happened and when everything got to this point, right? So while I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say it's been something like 5 or 10 years, I would go as far as to say it's probably been a few years. Valeria certainly looks older. Franklin looks a little bit older, right? So we'll say maybe something like 4 years or so. Again, we're not given an exact time frame here. It's just, you know, and now we're in this moment and things are popping off. But once they end up approaching what looks like the pantry, they basically end up hearing a kind of noise, right? They basically say, like, we've got weapons, you know, like we'll kill you if you try to attack us. They open the door and it's it looks like a bunch of humans in there, right? Like a bunch of regular people. And this is really one of the things where Peter Parker is interesting, because of course they end up basically, you know, liberating them and setting them free. And when Peter kind of starts to cry a little bit, Forge's idea is that it's like the old days, right? When they used to save innocent people, that kind of a thing. And Peter's response is, no, that's not why I'm crying. I'm crying because what awaits them out there is worse than whatever it was that was coming for them, whatever it was that was here. And my first thought was to just do them in. Right? So like spare them trying to make it out there. They won't last a day, right? Like they'll end up being turned or worse. And like my thought was I should just take them out and just make it easier, right? Peter Parker was thinking about just killing those people because it would have been an easier thing for them to deal with than everything else out there. And that's wildly different for Peter Parker, right? Like that's wildly out of character for Peter. It's not something that he would do. And that's designed to really show us how bad things have gotten, like how far things have fallen. Again, Marvel kind of just running through things really fast. And I feel like if I'm being honest with you guys, I feel like it really needs needs a little more oomph, a little more meat and potatoes to it, to kind of flesh things out a bit. I really feel like that's what this needs. But of course, this leads to the return of the Deadheads. And one of the things that kind of goes on is they basically say that like those folks were tributes, right? They were tributes that were being fed to basically the All-Strong. This individual there who was consuming those individuals, and with the Deadheads themselves, they were considered to be kind of not really, I guess they were assets to a degree, but so long as they were doing what they were doing, they would be spared, right? They'd be allowed to kind of continue existing. And so it's one part obsession and an almost cult-like mentality, and the other part just self-preservation. It's kind of what that seemed to be. But basically their whole thing is like, the All-Strong is going to come here now. Like when he gets here, like there's no hope for any of you guys. You have no idea what it is that you've done. And ultimately you kind of start hearing this sort of, booming sound and this kind of rumbling, and so on. And basically like this guy kind of starts to pray to the All-Strong, and the All-Strong ends up, of course, biting him in half, only for us to find out this is Beast, right? That Hank McCoy being infected while he was there, or else being infected and going there, has taken up residence in the Xavier Institute. Now, initially, there is an attempt to rationalize with him, right? Like Forge tries to rationalize with Beast and say, look, like we can find a cure, right? Like we need you, Hank McCoy. Like we know you're still in there somewhere. We need your mind. We need your intelligence. You're one of the foremost geneticists, right? You understand the nature of human biology. If anybody can fix this, it would be you. And Beast basically kind of utters the word cure and then says like, it's you we're curing, and then kills Forge. And so this really seems to take a page out of the original zombies, where they're still very much cognizant. They know exactly who they are. They're not really mindless beasts, right? So it's different from Deceased in that sense, in the way that like the Deceased characters who are out there are just like attacking things, right? Like they almost kind of seem to be completely mindless, unless you're being led by somebody like, like Black Adam or something like that, somebody who somehow managed to maintain a higher level of thinking, but that on the whole, they're not really kind of what they used to be, right? I mean, in this one, they're still pretty intelligent. Now, with Forge being killed, this leads to Nana intervening, and Nana basically goes to attack Beast, and then of course, Beast ends up attacking Nana. And of course, this leads into the arrival of Chewie. Now, Chewie was there and it consumed some of the zombies they had to deal with along, that they had to deal with leading up to basically the showing up of Nightcrawler. But Chewie was a character who appeared in Giant Size Captain Marvel, I think it was Giant Size Captain, maybe it was Giant Size Miss Marvel #1 during House of M. Chewie is what's called a flurkin. And basically you see Chewie in like the Marvel Cinematic Universe when it's the cat that can eat anything. But one thing to understand is the misconception there. Chewie doesn't really it can consume almost anything, but it doesn't really just let out tentacles. The idea is that flurkins contain within inside their own bodies, basically like pocket dimensions, like an infinite amount of space inside of a finite space, as crazy as that sounds. But within that space, they can house any number of things. For Chewie, it's housing a mouth that can consume pretty much anything. And that's basically what happens here. Like Chewie ends up manifesting and then subduing Beast, like grabbing Beast, bringing it in, killing him, basically, like doing Beast in. And that's it, right? Like Peter Parker kind of jumps in and basically you end up having Beast whose head is completely severed from his body. And then from there, it's like, okay, right? Like Moonstone more or less saved the day to a degree alongside Nana. And then they start asking Beast, like, what in the world is going on here, right? Like Franklin approaches Beast and says, like, where are my parents? Where are my mom and dad? Because these zombies aren't necessarily individual thinkers, right? They share a singular hive mind, right? Like they see what all the others see. And that's one of the things that they warn is like, because Beast has seen us now, it means that like wherever we are, like everybody else knows where we are. And if they knew that Beast was in the Xavier Institute, then now they all know we're in the Xavier Institute. Now, this is incredibly important. And the reason why is because if these zombies are functioning with a higher level of intelligence, then this is strategy. Put each one of them in a particular location to where heroes will most likely take refuge at. And when they arrive, suddenly everybody else knows they're there. And if they're looking for somebody in particular, if they're looking for Franklin or they're looking for Valeria, then they will know where they are at. And that's exactly what's revealed here. They're hunting for Franklin Richards. One thing to understand is that Franklin's powers don't seem to be working for some reason. We don't really know exactly why, but he's not really able to use his reality warping powers. It was kind of an offhanded remark that was made earlier by Valeria, but the implication seems to be he doesn't really have his high levels of telepathy, telekinesis, matter manipulation, or anything like that. If he did, he could certainly use those and save the day, but also remember, there's a big difference between Franklin as a little kid and Franklin as a full-on adult. When adult Franklin Richards showed up during Hickman's Avengers the New Avengers, during his Fantastic Four run, he had total control of his powers, right? He knew how to do anything he wanted to do, and he just required the power of his younger self in order to take on the other Celestials, so that it was basically like two Franklins in one, but he still knew how to use his powers. One of the big problems that Franklin's always had as a little kid is he never really knew how to use his abilities. He was never really trained on how to use his powers by read. There was always something else going on, or there were mental blocks put in place, whatever the case was. And so because of that, it made things a little complicated for Franklin's character. character. But what Beast basically says here is like, your family is with the Galactus Hive. Now, no one's seen the Galactus Hive for quite some time, and so either they've taken it somewhere, it's hidden, but nobody knows where it's at. And then basically Beast says like, they're hunting for you, Franklin, like we are looking for you and we are going to find you. Like, come and see your mother and father, right? Like, come back to Manhattan and we'll find out what's going on. And so at that point, you end up having, you know, Moonstone, who basically destroys the head of Beast, and then she takes off. Now, the reason she takes off is because of the fact that in her mind, going on a suicide mission to the Galactus Hive is kind of stupid, right? Like, the whole reason she joined Peter Parker in the first place is that she was attracted to the kind of fatherly role that Peter was playing for Franklin and Valeria, right? She liked that. But more so than that, they seem to have a purpose, right? And one of the things she talks about is like, in the early days of the invasion of New York, you had Bucky Barnes, you had a few people here and there who were fighting off against the invasion, right? So again, a good amount of time seems to have passed here, but they had a role to play, right? It was good guys versus bad guys. Things are pretty straightforward. But Peter Parker isn't really much of a hero anymore. He's lost in almost every conceivable way, the way that Moonstone sees it. And then in turn, going on a suicide mission to the Galactus Hive seems even worse. And so she's like, you guys go do your thing, but I am not going with you, right? Like, I'm not going on some suicide mission to the Galactus Hive in an effort to find the parents, the you know, zombie parents of some kid so he can have some hope. That's not going to work. But the other perspective from like Valeria and Franklin is far less grim, right? In their mind, Valeria even asked the question, what makes us think they're not some kind of evolutionary next step, right? Like, what keeps us from thinking that? What keeps it from being true? It is entirely possible. And Reed always said, like, there would be a way. Like, there's always a way. We're talking about a biological organism. There has to be a cure for this. And so it's really hope against hope, with Valeria and Franklin believing they can find Reed and they can actually bring things back to normal. Now, the way in which they're able to find the Galactus Hive comes from Valeria, and it's actually pretty genius. Because of the fact that Beast was on the original mission that essentially discovered this radiation where they were infected and they ended up becoming zombies, that because that radiation is still prevalent in Beast, they can actually track its source and they can get back to the Galactus Hive. Now, Peter jumps in the way and says, this is ridiculous, right? Like, you cannot cure a dead organism. It doesn't work this way. It's not how that kind of stuff works. And it's kind of the hope of Franklin and Valeria. How do you know they're dead? How do you know that they are actually dead? Like, there's no real way to know there. I mean, maybe they are, maybe they're not, but like, we can go there, we can tend to them and we can find out. And so of course, when you end up having them more or less kind of camping for a bit, Peter Parker getting some rest and then waking up only to find that like Valeria and Franklin and them are gone, he goes on the hunt for them only to be attacked out of nowhere. And for us to find out that Moonstone has become infected. And where she goes to attack Peter Parker, suddenly she starts getting chopped into pieces. Peter also finds Franklin and Valeria, right? So they're still safe, but like, she starts getting chopped into little pieces. And when that happens, then suddenly we get this kind of question coming out of nowhere, right? Like, let me see. And then we find out that it's Blade. Before this one showed up, I overheard, you know, the other two saying, you guys are going to go find the Galactus Hive. Do you have room for one more, right? So now they're here with Blade. And believe it or not, that makes a difference, right? Blade being here, the day is in a lot of ways saved. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Now we'll catch you all later. Peace.